Welcome to our conversation on meaning and purpose, science and religion. And this will be a conversation between myself, my name is Gleb Tsipursky, I am the co-founder and president of Intentional Insights, an organization for helping people refine and achieve their goals by improving their thinking, feeling, and behaviors. I'm also a professor of history in the history of science, specifically studying the intersection of psychology, cognitive neuroscience, and history. I teach in Ohio State University, and this is what I do. Now, the other person of this particular conversation is Caleb Pitkin. He'll introduce himself soon, but before we hear from him today, we will talk about meaning and purpose from a science perspective and a religious perspective. I will talk about it from the side of science, and Caleb, my good friend, will give the religious based view. A good conversation about meaning and purpose, and I think you'll enjoy it. So, Caleb, over to you now.
Well, as Gleb said, my name is Caleb Pitkin. I am a provisional elder in the United Methodist Church. So, despite my fashion choices, not a Catholic. Currently, I serve at Signal Mountain United Methodist Church, which is outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and I have been there about a month now, actually. I'm a graduate from the Methodist Theological School in Ohio with my Master of Divinity, and I have an economics degree from East Tennessee State University. And I've been really looking forward to doing this call with Gleb because this is a conversation that we have had many times before. And I hope that if you watch it, you enjoy it and you take a lot out of it, because I know that I have enjoyed my conversations on this topic with Gleb in the past.
All right. Thank you, Caleb. Yeah, I can imagine how great of an engagement we can have about this topic, and it'll be very fascinating, I think. You will all enjoy our conversation about it. So, we will talk about finding meaning and purpose by getting at the perspective of science first. Then we will discuss and reflect on differences of religious perspectives and scientific perspectives, and the similarities of these two perspectives. And we will see what we can learn by taking both perspectives and then uniting them together in a synthesis. Then we will find what are the similarities as well as differences of both perspectives. Now, I wrote a book about finding meaning and purpose using science, which basically talks about the science of finding your purpose from a broad scientific perspective and developing people's personal sense of meaning and purpose. It's available on intentionalinsights.org. The research shows that there are three broad areas of finding meaning and purpose. One of the broad areas is basically self-reflection. Self-reflection is thinking about oneself, about how one finds one's sense of meaning and purpose, and about how one remembers meaning and purpose from past events. Now, the second part is broader. The second area is community, namely building community. You can form community by getting involved in any type of community engagement and social engagement that would help you develop your meaning and purpose. The third point is serving others. So all sorts of activities which you yourself perceive as serving others and that are meaningful to you for serving others. So this could be donating, this could be sharing anything that relates to you serving others. This could also be in the form of serving family. That's also a means of serving others and of finding community bonds. So those are the three areas. There are some religious-based approaches that are very similar to these three broad scientific areas that I describe in my book. And I'll now turn it over to Caleb to talk about religious approaches.
Well, I agree with a lot of what you've talked about we find meaning and purpose in community, we find it in serving others. And I think that one of the reasons so many people have found their meaning and purpose in organized religion is, at its best, the church can offer all kinds of places for you to have community and to perform service. I think for me as a religious person, a lot of my sense of meaning and purpose in life comes from my relationship with God. And that's an obvious part of the religious life. I think too that I sort of separate meaning and purpose, become really synonymous in most conversation. And we'll probably use it fairly synonymously here. But I think I get a lot of meaning from my life in my relationship with God, knowing that no matter what, I am loved and cared for and all of those things by God. And I think I get a lot of my purpose in life in the sort of serving God and serving others that I think, particularly Christianity, and I would hate to be perceived as commenting anywhere near as deeply on other religions as I will on Christianity, but Christianity calls for a service to God that is in part a service to others. And I think that that is something that gives people a terrific sense of meaning and something that churches can do very well. I think sort of the religious addendum I would add is that almost everything Gleb said is one of those like yes to all, yes to community, yes to service, yes to looking into yourself, yes to all, but to also look outside of yourself. I think that there is a part of most people that wants to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And I think for me and for millions of other Christians and for probably billions of other religious people, finding that thing that is bigger than ourselves has been about finding God and finding God's sort of, and this could be a whole nother discussion, but what it means for God's plan for our life. And maybe I'm going to regret those quotation bunnies later when people watch this, but what God's plan is and what God's purpose may be for our life.
Thank you, Caleb, for showing the different perspective. Just to be clear, that meaning in science in the third area, serving others, is more than about yourself. It's about serving others and reaching out to them. Now, I want to go back to what you were saying earlier, that religion can be helpful in finding meaning and purpose. There are indeed many studies that have shown that religion can be an important way of finding the purpose of your life. So, what the studies show is that religious people overall have a greater sense of meaning and purpose than people from non religious, secular settings. But the studies don't get at the specifics of why. Let me cite an example. For example, a religious studies of religious worship in private settings show that they don't result in a higher sense of meaning and purpose in life. Meaning and purpose that religion provides come through things like self-reflection, things like serving others, community activities, and so on. So I'm curious, with that in mind, is whether what religious people perceive as their sense of meaning and purpose comes from religious faith, or just the things that science says give you meaning and purpose, and they happen to take place within religious communities, making the community setting the key, not the faith itself.
I think that my take on it is we are much more geared towards community as human beings than we tend to think we are as part of our Western culture. Our cultural icons are like the lone wolf, the lone cowboy, I mean, the lone ranger, and we forget, his buddy Tonto. But I think that individualized faith can also give people a sense of meaning and purpose. But like everything else, almost, it is better to share it and not just share it in the sense of like evangelism, but to share it and know that other people believe what we believe, other people are doing what we're doing, is something that helps us. And I'm going to say this, I have not had a whole lot of experience with really truly individualized religion. I mean, as a Christian minister, I work in the church. Like my job is community religion. And I meet lots of people who say that, well, I don't need to go to church to be a Christian and things like that. But I honestly tend to disagree with it. I think with anything you do, you need to be with other people doing it, or else it just becomes a pursuit of self. if you say, well, I'm just going to figure it out all on my own, I don't need to share it with anyone, I just need to find everything within myself, I think that that creates a very deep sense of loneliness that can attack your sense of meaning and purpose, that is not 100% from others, but is drawn in large part from others. If that
You know,
sort of answers your question.
Yeah, I think this is similar to my perspective. My personal opinion is that it's really hard to find meaning and purpose by oneself. But I think you might have gotten in trouble by saying that the Christians can't be Christians by themselves. But anyway, I'm with you on everything being better overall in a community setting. But it's possible, I believe, to find meaning and purpose by oneself. I'm glad to hear you say that for people who don't have a religion, who are secular, that they should not be deprived of community, as community overall is vital to health and well-being, as well as meaning and purpose in particular. I very much think that whatever we do is better done together. It's better done within communities with others. The social bonds and actions that impact others are so powerful, and it's so great to have a sense of personal fulfillment, a sense of connection, a sense of meaningfulness, that sense of joy. There's a lot of research in social science in how we have different mirror neurons that mirror the feelings of others. So that suggests that we can find a sense of joy and happiness about watching people connect with each other, as without communities they would be unable to connect with others. So I'm really glad that you support secular people connecting with others outside of religious settings.
Well, Gleb, I'm going to tell you, I'm having a bit of trouble hearing you. I'm catching, I think, all of it, but sometimes the volume's changing a little. But I agree with you that one of the things we have done, and that there are not a lot of places for secular people to experience the kind of community that religious people experience. And I think that that is a tragedy, honestly. I mean, sure, as a pastor, as a Christian, I would love it if everyone came to church and if everyone found their community in the church, but that's not feasible. That's not realistic. People still, though, shouldn't be isolated just because they don't believe in God. And so I think like the rise of secular organizations is one of those things a lot of pastors may see it as threatening, but I think it's a needed thing for the rise of secular people in society. To talk about my time with Columbus Rationality and being a part of a group made mostly of atheists or non-theists or secular people or humanists or however people were most comfortable wording it, was at times an odd experience. I will confess that. I mean, for a pastor to come and be a part of that without any motivation to like sneakily convert people is it's unusual. But what I saw there was the importance of, even in this pursuit of science, even in this pursuit of rationality, even in saying like I want to improve my thinking, how I process things and how I interact with the world, even in that pursuit that ran the risk of being so individualized, improving my thinking, improving how I interact, improving how I do things, even that still benefited from community, because there are things that you will never be able to really see about yourself, that you need other people to say, well, you're doing good here, you're doing poorly there. We need other people for that. And I think maybe I said it too extremely. I think it is possible to find meaning and purpose by yourself. I think it is theoretically, or in extreme circumstances, possible to be a Christian by yourself. But I think these things are far less than the ideal. And if you're choosing to do them that way, then you're choosing to make it much harder, unnecessarily harder to find it.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying your thinking, which is that it's much harder for people that are trying to find purpose by oneself. including Christians. I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said about how hard it is to have a more clear perspective on what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong, and what's going well and what's not going well with you when you're by yourself. And I think Columbus Rationality is also an example, which is the place where you and I were in community. So I think the conversation going there was richer when you were there to give your unique perspective. It's great to have the diversity brought by a minister in the community of people who strive to gain greater rationality and rational thinking and tend to be overall secular.
I think one of the biggest sort of misconceptions about most religious communities is that they are homogenous. And that is not to say that we don't have a lot of work to do in making religious communities less homogenous. I mean, certainly one of the things you could easily point out is most churches have a clear race, a clear dominant race. There are black churches, there are white churches, and that is, I think, one of the biggest growing areas of the church's growth in perspective. But any church of any size usually tends to attract people with all kinds of theological views. I mean, certainly as the pastor, I would not think everyone agrees with everything I say, or even the Methodist theology that the church sort of tries to base itself on. So there's a theological diversity. The church is, I think, also one of the few places in America that tries to appeal to people of all different ages. And so the church at a healthy community has people at all stages of life and tries to reach and communicate with them in a way that, I mean, where else do you try to appeal to someone in their 80s and someone who's just turned 18 and someone who's just entered the 8th grade? I mean, it's a very difficult line to walk. And so I think there's a lot more diversity in religious communities than even really first appears when you look at one. But one of the things that rationality did for me is it made me think being the only Christian in a group is such a rare experience that having people say something that they thought no Christian or no pastor was there to hear, and then realizing that I was there and I had heard it, made me question how many times I speak as if everyone who listens to me is a Christian. And the things that I say that might be taken, not how I met them, by someone who is sort of in the group I'm talking about. So I will say it's really changed my view of how I talk about secular people, how I talk about non-Christians, because I have, even when I look out at my congregation, if I have visitors, I have no idea if they consider themselves atheist, if they consider themselves Christian, if they consider themselves to be any number of things. And so it's made me much more careful about the words I use. But I also think diversity helps with meaning and purpose in that it exposes us to meanings and purposes that we might never have considered before. And that we may take on as ourselves. We may say, well, that's a great way to find meaning and purpose in life, and I want to find it that way. Or we may just use them to expand and to augment how we were already finding meaning and purpose in life. Because I think the science, at its best, Christian theology has always used thinking from outside the church. In the beginning, they used Greek philosophy to help articulate Christian theology. And I think we are at a stage where we have a choice about whether we can look at these scientific findings on how people are discovering their meaning and purpose, and we can try to take some of the best of them and graft them onto the church. We have the opportunity to once again pillage the knowledge of the other world and use it ourselves. So something for you to look forward to, Gleb.
Yeah, that's nice. So I found it really curious while you were talking about the diversity in church, and I learned more about your perspective and other religious people's perspective about how you and others find meaning and purpose in God. That's to me a very interesting perspective on how meaning and purpose can be found in the church and really clarifies it, and how it can be found in serving God and sharing God's love. It's interesting that there are such differences between how that word of God's love is used. I'm really glad that you gained the perspective on secular people thinking and talking in your experience of Columbus rationality, and how to be careful and thoughtful in speaking and considering different perspectives. Can you share more about how various Christians think and describe the meaning and the purpose of non religious people? I want to have more information to have a clearer view.
Well, I think I don't think it's healthy for the pastor to stand up and say, well, as Christians, our meaning and purpose has to be this. I think you can offer suggestions, you can offer pointers, you can offer what other Christians have found, but I think each person's relationship with God is by nature different. And we perceive God differently based on our life experiences, our social locations, the traditions we grow up in, even the friends we have, we experience God a little differently based on our relationships outside the church, I think. And so this idea that there is like a monolithic answer to what a Christian person's meaning and purpose is, I think is sort of, to find it, you would have to take such like helicopter view things. And so, yes, like every Christian, I think would probably report their relationship with God as a source of meaning. But I don't think that that's any different than most people would say, like, my relationships with my family and friends are a source of meaning. You know, your family and friends, even if someone shares the same family and shares the same friends, they take a different meaning from them. That's just the truth of our different perspectives. And so, of course, like even my purpose as a pastor is a little different than what a layperson might feel their purpose is in the church and their purpose is in life. And so I think maybe you could say the like religious spectrum of meaning and purpose is narrower, right? If you go outside of, we have different bookends, and I'll claim that we have things like, if you found your meaning and purpose in the church and God wasn't involved at all, I would think that that was strange at least. But it's not a one size fits all thing. It is about exploring God and wrestling with God and finding what God's meaning and purpose for each individual life is. And then, to go super Methodist on it, choosing to respond to that call by God in your life. So I think you can pick out a few threads that are probably consistent from most religious people. But I think there is enough individuality, and there should be enough individuality, that there is difference, there is diversity in that. And Christians, I think, tend to articulate this in call language, that my call is to be a pastor, an elder in the United Methodist Church, but someone's call may be to be a Sunday school teacher, someone's call may be to visit people in prison, someone's call may be to visit the sick. And I think some people's call may be totally separate from what even we traditionally consider religion and part of the church. So I think that God has all kinds of meanings and purposes for all of our lives, and that there's not just a one size fits all answer. If that sort of gets at your question a little. I said I think that there's no one size fits all religious meaning and purpose. And sometimes people present it like there is, but I don't think
Mm.
anything presented that way fits perfectly. You're looking for a custom tailored meaning and purpose, not an off the rack meaning and purpose. And so I think that within the religious community, there is diversity in how people understand that. And there should be, and that's healthiest instead of all having the same one.
Okay, so I'm curious to learn a little bit more about this, because what I recall from my experience with some other Christians is that they have a different perspective than you. For example, people like Rick Warren and others prescribe some clear purpose in life about how you must live your life for serving God, finding your meaning only for God, and so on. How do you personally respond to this much more prescriptive and narrow condition of the way that a person needs to find their purpose and meaning?
Well, I think, and I'm going to confess to not having a huge familiarity with Rick Warren's work. So if I say something that just is wrong, I'm sorry for that, Rick. It's been a while since I've read your book, but I think at its to sort of give it my best possible understanding on it, right? You would say that one of the ways to find meaning and purpose is through science. And your book offers a lot of activities and thinking about how to find your meaning and purpose through science. And so someone might take that to its extreme form and say, like, well, Gleb thinks to find your meaning and purpose, you need to only do these things. Rick Warren, I think, in saying that our meaning and purpose as Christians and as people is to worship God, to love others, to serve others, and to sort of along that path. I think those may be sort of those major threads I was talking about. But how do you worship God is an incredibly diverse thing. I mean, if you want to see an example of that, go to several different churches on Sunday morning. I mean, you can go from everything from handling snakes to Latin, you know? There is an incredible diversity in how one can worship God. And what is serving God? I mean, I love the shaker imagery around serving God, that every task you do you should view as service to God and do your best at it. So even something simple like sweeping a floor or building a chair or anything you do is not just serving others and not just your task, but is serving God. And so if you take that view of it, there's an incredible amount of things you can do to serve God. And then to love others, I mean, there are many people I love in my life, but I think I love each of them in different ways. And so to say love others is something you should do and something that Christians should view as their purpose is one of those, once you get down to that brass tacks of how you do it, there is no one way. And so I think Rick Warren is trying to offer these broad strokes, these threads that most Christians in most times and in most places have found as sources of meaning, but he's not trying to get into the minutia of how you do it and say, and the only way you can love others is like this. And the only way to worship God is like this. And the only way to serve God is this. And so I think maybe there's a real possibility that those things are the bookends of like the Christian meaning and purpose experience is loving God and loving others. I'd be very comfortable with saying should be sources of meaning and purpose for all Christians. But it is trying to enforce a this is how you do it that I think is too far.
Yeah, I think I like the way you frame this, which is similar to how I describe it in my book. I appreciate that you take a broad perspective instead of a narrow one about how serving God is the only path to meaning and purpose. And you're saying that's not the only way. And I think that there are clear similarities between religion and specific strategies I describe in my book. And these are things like journaling that I describe in my book, Things like meditation, building community and social bonds, serving others, finding purpose in your workplace for your work. These are science based strategies for finding meaning and purpose in life. After all, science is the best way of uncovering the truth, and if we don't study science, we can't ever know what's truly beneficial or not for finding meaning and purpose in life. So I'll now share about my own path to finding my personal sense of meaning and purpose. In my teenage years, I felt a real sense of deep emptiness within myself, a real lack of meaning and purpose. I didn't know how to find that sense of meaning and purpose in life. I tried to look for it and talked to people I trusted and read great books, but I really didn't get anywhere until I started to learn about the science on meaning and purpose. That's what really pushed my scholarship in this area and my decision to pursue my research on meaning and purpose. Now, scholars who study this topic see meaning and purpose as that broad aspiration, the overarching set of goals that drives your everyday activities. This helped me determine my own personal sense of meaning and purpose, which comes from happiness, fulfillment, and flourishing. And happiness for me is a sense that I have satisfaction and contentment and pleasure and joy in moderation throughout my life, and a greater sense of happiness in the future. Fulfillment to me is a sense that I am fulfilling my personal values toward myself, toward others around me, and toward my personal and broader communities, and greater fulfillment throughout my life. And flourishing is a sense that I am well and I have well being and thriving in all of my life areas, which I define as my self life area, so my personal self, my life partnership area with the love of my life, my wife Agnes Vishnevkin, who's the co founder of Intentional Insights, my social circle areas, those are my friends, people I care about, my professional life area, so my career, and then my civic engagement area, so my volunteer work, including with Intentional Insights. And that I have a greater sense of happiness, fulfillment, and flourishing in the future is important to me for having a sense of meaning and purpose. So those are the things that form my sense of meaning and purpose, and from which I derive my purpose. And I'm curious to hear about how these aspirations of happiness, fulfillment, and flourishing compare to the Christian perspective you describe of loving God, and serving others as part of serving God.
Well, as you were talking particularly about flourishing, I was thinking of a scripture, which is not an unusual occurrence for a pastor, but there's a passage in the Bible that says, I have come that you may have life and have it abundantly. And that is a particular favorite scripture of mine. And so I think we make God sound boring. And I am sure that I am guilty of it. And if someone went through my sermons and interviewed all my parishioners, they could point out specific times I've been guilty of it. But God wants us to have full, rich, abundant lives. And so I think we say, love God, love others, and we make it sound like it's just those things. Like, oh, well, I love God today, so check that off the list. And I, did something nice for my wife, so check that off the list. I've loved others. And now I sort of have nothing left to do. But I think that it's so much more than that. You were talking about your personal sense of meaning and purpose, and I'd kind of like to go to mine a little as an example of a religious person. So to me, I want to have joy, and part of finding my meaning and purpose is seeing if my life is joyful, not just sort of happiness, which I sort of take as a more fleeting emotion, but is what I'm doing, is who I'm with, is where I'm spending my time, bringing me an overall sense of joy rather than an immediate sense of happiness. I think the other is I feel very passionately about doing well in my call, being a good minister, being able to articulate the faith well, being able to tell people about Jesus in a way that reaches them, which is, I think, become more of a challenge in the modern world than it has been in a long time as we increasingly live in a post-Christian society. And not to sort of get into nightmare scenarios about that some people get into, but it does create a different challenge than we've dealt with as a church before, when most people have very little experience with the church compared with 50 years ago. And so learning about the world and learning how to present the gospel well to people is something that I take a lot of pride in. And if I ever felt that I had stagnated in my professional goal, my sense of meaning and purpose would suffer. And the other is to be very appreciative. I think gratitude is something that goes hand in hand with meaning and purpose that we sort of haven't talked about. And so part of loving God to me is being grateful for things in my life. When I go for a run in the morning and I see the beauty of creation, to feel gratitude towards God for that. It may sound like a hokey little card, but having someone to thank for things, I think, helps me. And I think can help a lot of people. And not, I mean, I would even say for secular people, it doesn't have to be God. To look out at a beautiful scene and say, well, thank you, God, is not something a secular person is going to do, but to think, wow, I am grateful for the people who maintain this park. And I am grateful for the people who've made sure that where I go, there's not trash and filth, and that the lawn is cut, and that the things are nice, I think would help with meaning and purpose a lot. And so I think that this view that our meaning and purpose as religious people has to be restrictive is is wrong. I think that our sources are supposed to be as big as life can be. And that if your religious life becomes a mere checking off of lists to avoid some sort of eternal punishment, then you have missed what God has wanted for you. And that is to enjoy life and to flourish in it and to find satisfaction in all kinds of things inside the church, outside the church, in what we consider the secular world and what we consider the religious world. Those are all supposed to be places where we experience the joyful life that God desires us to have. And I don't know, this is something I feel very passionate about, is not limiting what the Christian life is supposed to be to some boring, I go to church on Sunday and sure, I read the Bible for 15 minutes a day, boring list checking. It's supposed to be a joyful response to a God who we believe has loved us first and calls us to love God by loving and serving others. Like, to me, that is a wonderful gift. And it is one that I am grateful to be able to ask people to participate in and to participate in myself every day. I feel like I sort of went on a tangent there rather than directly answered your questions, but maybe that's a hazard of the job, is to always go off on weird little tangents. But
It's interesting speaking about the different words that we use and how we think about them. I think when you say joy, to me it is the same as happiness. I think we're discussing the same concept, and the difference is only in minor semantics and how we use words. Even though we use different terms, I perceive happiness as, in the long run, a sense of a stable and continuing experience. You talked about the importance of your professional area, and for me, my professional area is an important component of flourishing. It's fascinating to see these parallels between a science-informed perspective on life and a religious-informed perspective on life, and how they intersect in the area of meaning and purpose. Now, regarding gratitude, science is really helpful for that. And there are specific strategies to use that you can use for yourself to get that sense. One is a gratitude diary, where you write down what you're grateful for daily or every several days. Talk about what you're really grateful for and what has happened in your life which you appreciate. We too often forget when we see the beautiful sunset that we should be grateful for, that we should be grateful for our being on the earth each day. We should be grateful to our world. We should be grateful to the friends we have for being our friends. We should be grateful to our community. We should be grateful to the whole of mankind. I'm grateful to technology because Caleb moved away from where he lived right by me in Columbus, Ohio, but now I can talk with him through the help of modern technology. I'm grateful to this modern technology. And I'm grateful to all of you viewers for listening to us. I really appreciate you checking out our conversation and look forward to your thoughts and comments. Caleb and I agreed to a last stage where we would share what we gained from this hangout and how we shared our perspectives in any ways. Caleb will have the first opportunity to reflect that, and then turn it over to me and I'll share my feelings. All right, Caleb, over to you now.
Well, I think that one of the things that always strikes me when we talk about this is there are a lot of different ways to get at very similar things. And our sense of meaning and purpose in life are very, very similar. And I think that that shows something about what we talked about community. We are all, of course, unique, but it doesn't mean we're all so different that nothing travels from person to person. And so I think that most of us, if we really got down to what we hold that's important, where we get our meaning and purpose, the most important things in our lives, we're going to have a lot more that are the same than are different. And so I think one of the things that we do that's a huge disservice to people is act like you have to choose all the time between two hugely different things. Science is now showing are effective and that they work. And so I think that that's a really interesting thing that we have stumbled into effective strategies for finding meaning and purpose that are being confirmed by science and that will work for most people. And so don't take our uniqueness to mean that I can't learn anything from others, and don't take our communities to mean that I can't learn anything from another community, because most of us are probably more similar than we are different. And so I think that this talking with you about these things always makes me think how close we are in a lot of ways with how different our starting point is. And I don't know, I've always found that intriguing.
I like Caleb's perspective. I find often when I talk with him and others from a different worldview that we tend to overestimate our actual differences. It's really curious that the result of this conversation shows how science and meaning and purpose can be found to apply and reflect on the wide variety of ways that people find meaning and purpose. This science shows that traditional ways of meaning and purpose in religious communities indeed do lead to meaning and purpose, but they're not the only ways to do so. Now that we know the science, we can learn about other ways of finding meaning and purpose than in religious communities. For example, we talked about Columbus rationality, where Caleb and I both found community, and this community was part of a broader community of secular humanists, the humanist community of Central Ohio. It was really interesting to me how church settings use some strategies that have been shown to be effective by science. For example, Caleb spoke about how Bible study can be a source of meaning and purpose for reflecting on meaning and purpose as found in God. That's essentially self-reflection in a group setting through the form of Bible studying. People can gain similar benefits, science shows, for just getting together and talking about their sense of meaning and purpose, regardless of their religious background. Those who are religious can talk about religion if they wish, or other things that bring them meaning and purpose, and those who are non religious can talk about topics. but I'm guessing both would get a similar boost to their sense of meaning and purpose. I think the broader takeaway for me is how the strategies that Caleb and I use and advocate are really similar, and how our overarching goals are quite similar. Science can show you the most effective strategies of getting your goals and finding meaning and purpose, but it doesn't say that religious path is the good one or the bad one. Religious path is only one way of getting at meaning and purpose in life, and there are other ones available. So I think it was a really great conversation about how we can find meaning and purpose in a wide variety of paths. And I think it's fascinating, Caleb, that your sense of meaning and purpose is quite similar to mine. Something that I learned and something you showed me, Caleb, is the diversity of perspectives within religious communities. I do think you're a little generous with the leeway you give to Rick Warren and others, but I really appreciate your more compassionate and broader perspective. I indeed hope that other Christians will adopt a similar perspective. I really appreciate hearing your encouragement of secular people finding their meaning and purpose in non religious settings as well, even though it's not your preference, of course, to have secular people and not have them within religious communities. But it's good to see that we both support secular people finding secular communities. I hope you'll enjoy between this conversation between Caleb Pitkin and myself, Gleb Sipursky, the professor of history and science of history of science at Ohio State and the president and co-founder of Intentional Insights. We help you improve your thinking, feelings, and behavior patterns and refine them to reach your goals at intentionalinsights.org. And my book is also available on the website itself. This conversation was a specific example of how one can really improve one's thinking by comparing one's perspective to the perspective of others who come from very different starting points, as Caleb said. It really helps to find that the differences we imagine between our perspectives are truly much smaller than we initially perceived. So I hope this is what you will take away and hope you enjoyed this conversation. Goodbye.